95 tons of steel, a bucket that could take 8 tons of rock in a single bite and never slow down long enough to think about it. Somewhere in a gash cut 200 feet into a Panamanian mountain, that bucket is swinging at the end of a cable as thick as a man's forearm, and that cable is the only thing standing between 40,000 pounds of dead load and the men working underneath it. Listen to it, the clank of chain-drive gears biting into a fresh weld, the scream of a boiler running past 140 pounds of pressure, the groan of wire rope drawing tight over a sheave, with maybe 6 inches of daylight between that rope and the man standing next to it. That groan is not a machine working. That groan is a machine deciding whether today is the day it kills somebody. Could 6 inches of daylight really be the whole margin between an ordinary shift and a funeral? Could a company really know that and ship the machine anyway? Look at the teeth on that bucket. Cast steel, each one the length of a man's forearm, built to rip into rock that dynamite has only half broken. Now look at what's holding that bucket up in the air. Not a beam, not a chain, a twisted length of steel wire, wound around a drum by an engine that never stops moving, running the entire load through a component you could wrap your 2 hands around. Every ounce of the machine's power funnels down into that one piece of hardware. So does every ounce of the machine's risk. Here is what never made it onto the postcards. The same steel cable that let this machine outwork 50 men with picks was, under load, storing enough force to open a man from throat to knee in the half-second it took to part. The company called it wire rope. The men standing next to it, when they bothered to give it a name, called it something closer to a loaded gun that never ran dry. This is the story of the cable shovel, the machine that carved the ditch connecting 2 oceans, and in doing it, cut through the workforce running it, quietly, routinely, in numbers nobody back home was ever meant to add up. It moved more earth than any machine in human history had moved before it. It also fell, eventually. The ground didn't run out. An entire industry simply ran out of ways to pretend a rope this dangerous was just the price of getting the job done. How many men did this machine actually take? Why did an industry that prided itself on precision let that number go officially uncounted? And why did it take a full generation of engineers before anyone stopped writing it down as the cost of progress? We're about to find out, starting with the facts that shouldn't be true, and somehow are. The rope was always going to kill someone. Start with this. By the time this canal was finished, more than 5,600 men were dead. Not enemy fire, not old age, a mountain, a machine, and enough dynamite to erase a small city. Now sit with this. 27,000 metric tons of explosive went into that mountain to soften it up for the shovels. That is enough force, gathered in one place, to level a city block, and the men loading it worked within arm's reach of the machines that would come along afterward and dig through what was left. Here's the part that should not be possible. On a single afternoon in December, this machine's own steel rigging helped set off 22 tons of that dynamite in one uncontrolled blast. 23 men did not go home that night. 40 more went home in pieces. Here's the part nobody printed in bold letters. Steel cable under load does not fail the way you'd expect. It does not go slack. It does not simply drop. A parted rope gathers every ounce of force it was holding back and throws it backward, sideways, at head height, faster than a man can flinch out of the way. The crew on this machine worked inches from a rope like that for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a decade straight. Here's a fact that sounds like a typo and isn't. This machine's own crew rode inches from that rope for a full 10-hour shift, with nothing between them and it. No cage, no shield, not so much as a painted line on the deck, marking off a zone a sane man would stay out of. Modern riggers have a name for the space in front of a taut cable, the direction it recoils when it fails. They call it the strike zone, and every safety course today spends real time teaching men to stay out of it. In 1904, that concept didn't have a name yet. It just had a body count. The only warning system was experience, and experience only worked until the day it didn't. Here's the strangest fact of all. The machine that killed those 23 men isn't remembered by name in a single popular history of the canal. The company that built it is still standing today. And as of the last confirmed record, one surviving example of this exact class of machine sits quietly outside a university in Costa Rica, treated less like a killer and more like a curiosity nobody's gotten around to restoring. One shovel, a single unit, on a single project, could excavate more than 1,000,000 cubic yards of earth over its working life. That same shovel, on its worst day, could take 5 or 6 men with it, and the company barely had to answer for it. 77 of these machines worked this one cut. Do the arithmetic on that for a second, and then try to tell yourself it's just a story about engineering. We'll come back to that December afternoon. It's the reason this video exists. But first, how does a company end up building something like this in the first place? What problem was so impossible that an industry decided a machine this violent was worth the risk? A cornfield company builds a beast for a ditch between two oceans. The problem this machine was built to solve had already humiliated better-funded engineers twice over. In 1839, a Philadelphia civil engineer named William Otis patented the first steam-powered excavator in history, a crane-mounted shovel that could gouge earth out of a railroad, cutting faster than any gang of men with picks. It worked. It also worked badly. Chain hoists jerked and stalled. The bucket bit unevenly. And for decades, nobody solved the machine's biggest limitation. It could dig a cut through a hillside just fine, but it couldn't take a clean, level scoop off flat, open ground. Otis never lived to see any of that get fixed. He died of typhoid fever before his 30th birthday, less than a year after the patent was granted, and the machine he'd invented spent the next 4 decades being improved by men who never knew his name either. Then, sometime in the 1870s, the industry made a change that looked like a safety upgrade and turned into something far more dangerous. Steel wire rope replaced the old chain lift hoists. It ran smoother over the sheaves. It was stronger, pound for pound, than anything forged in a chain. It even let crews shrink. One shovel builder trimmed his machine's operating crew from 3 men down to 2, purely on the strength of how much more controllable wire rope was to run. Engineers loved it. What almost nobody advertised was that a taut steel rope, unlike a chain, stores its failure as pure kinetic violence, and it would take the industry another 70 years to fully reckon with what that meant for the men standing near it. By 1884, a British engineer had solved the swing problem too, building the first full revolving shovel, one that could rotate the boom a complete circle instead of working in a stiff, limited arc. The design spread fast. Railroads on 2 continents were tearing through hillsides and needed something bigger than a man with a pick. In 1880, a foundry in the middle of Ohio farm country, the Bucyrus Foundry and Manufacturing Company, started building machines to meet that demand. 400 miles east, in Marion, Ohio, a rival outfit was doing the same thing. Neither company had any idea they were about to be handed the largest earth-moving contract in the history of the world. That contract had already broken one country. France had spent 15 years and a fortune trying to cut a sea-level canal through the Panamanian Isthmus, and the jungle beat them. Landslides, disease, an engineering plan that never accounted for what the ground itself would do under pressure. The prize was too big to walk away from twice. A finished canal meant ships bound from New York to San Francisco would no longer have to round Cape Horn at the bottom of South America, a detour that could eat the better part of a year, cut down, once this machine finished its work, to a matter of weeks. By 1904, when the United States restarted the project, the first American chief engineer arrived to find death everywhere he looked. Yellow fever and malaria were killing workers by the hundreds. He was so certain the job would kill him too that he arranged, ahead of time, to have his own metal coffin shipped south. That was before a single cable shovel had even arrived on site. When the machines did come, they came from Bucyrus. The Isthmian Canal Commission placed its first order in 1904, one 70-ton shovel, two 95-tonners, and kept ordering. Marion fought for a piece of the contract and lost most of it, until the Secretary of War, an Ohio man himself, leaned on the commission to throw his home state company a share of the work. By the time the dust settled, Bucyrus had supplied 77 of the 102 shovels working the canal. Marion got 24. One smaller outfit built the last one. Two rival Ohio foundries, 40 miles apart, ended up shoulder to shoulder in a jungle 600 miles from either of their front doors, competing, in the middle of a construction site people were dying on, to see who could dig faster. The worst stretch of the whole project earned its own nickname on site, Hell's Gorge. Officially, it was the Culebra Cut, a 9-mile slash carved straight through the spine of the Continental Divide. Unofficially, it was a non-stop cauldron of roaring locomotives, belching steam shovels, dynamite smoke, and men who understood that drowning and electrocution were now just two more ways this job could kill you, on top of everything else. 6,000 men worked the cut at its peak, a small army of crane men, engineers, firemen, and rail crews. Every one of them just far enough from that hoist cable to feel safe and just close enough to be wrong. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt climbed up onto one of these Bucyrus shovels during an inspection tour and had himself photographed at the controls, grinning like a man who'd never once had to stand in the strike zone of a loaded hoist cable. The photograph became one of the most famous images of American engineering ever taken. It said nothing about what the crew standing just out of frame already knew about that rope, because by then, the machine was already setting records that made the danger look worth it. The whole project ran on a budget of roughly $350 million, a figure that would run past $10 billion today, and every one of these shovels was a line item the accountants back in Washington watched as closely as the engineers did. In March of 1910, a single Bucyrus shovel excavated 70,000 cubic yards of rock and dirt in 26 days, a canal construction record that stood as proof the whole gamble was paying off. Individually, these shovels would go on to average more than 1 million cubic yards excavated apiece over the life of the project. The numbers were staggering. The company newsletters loved them. Almost nobody was keeping a parallel column for what those numbers cost in men. We still haven't answered the question this video opened with: how a company ends up quietly absorbing a body count like that and just keeps shipping product. Part of the answer is sitting in the machine itself, because the same piece of hardware setting all those records was, on every single lift, one bad strand away from becoming a weapon. That's the trade this machine was built on from day one. Raw output, purchased with a danger nobody put a real price tag on. And the deeper you look at how the thing actually worked, the clearer it gets that the danger came baked into the physics itself, not from some flaw a better engineer could have designed away. Steam, steel, and the physics of a rope that wants to kill you. Every ounce of violence this machine was capable of ran through one component the size of a man's wrist. Strip away the boiler, the gears, the 95 tons of black iron, and what you're left with is a length of twisted steel wire doing a job no chain could do as smoothly, and hiding a danger no chain had. Here's how the beast actually moved. A vertical fire tube boiler, running somewhere between 120 and 160 pounds of steam pressure, fed 3 separate reciprocating engines. One engine drove the hoist, winding the main cable onto a drum to lift the loaded dipper clear of the cut. A second drove the crowd mechanism, a rack and pinion system that thrust the dipper stick forward into the rock face, forcing the bucket's teeth deeper into ground that had already been softened, or should have been, by dynamite. A third engine handled the swing, rotating the whole upper deck so a 5 cubic yard bucket loaded with 8 tons of spoil could tip cleanly into a waiting rail car. Fire, into steam, into piston, into gear, into cable, into 8 tons of moving rock. Every link in that chain had to hold, every single cycle, for the whole thing to work. None of those three systems worked in isolation. The hoist engine lifted while the crowd engine pushed and the swing engine rotated, sometimes all three fighting the load at once, and every one of those forces eventually resolved down through the same cable running over the same sheaves. Overload any single motion, crowd too hard into unbroken rock, swing too fast with a full bucket still rising, and the hoist rope was the component absorbing the shock. It had no way to refuse the load. It could only carry it until the day it couldn't. Every cycle took roughly a minute, start to finish. Bite, lift, swing, dump, swing back, drop. Multiply that by 10 hours, by 6 days, by the length of an 8-year project, and you start to understand exactly how many individual chances that rope was given to fail. But could a rope built for that kind of repeated violence actually survive it? Shift after shift, in tropical heat that could top 100 degrees. That was the question nobody wanted to answer honestly, because the honest answer was, not always. So how did a crew know when a rope had reached the end of its working life? Here's the uncomfortable answer. In this era, there was no numbered chart on the wall telling a crane man how many broken strands meant a rope had to come off the drum. No engineering body had yet written down a formal, measurable rejection standard, the kind of thing modern operators take for granted, where a fixed count of broken wires in a single wrap of cable is an automatic, no-argument order to replace it. None of that existed yet. In 1904, judging a rope's condition came down to one man's eyes, one man's hands running along the strands, and one man's willingness to tell a foreman the job needed to stop. On a project running against the clock of an 8-year deadline, that conversation did not happen as often as it should have. Here's the mechanism the industry didn't advertise. A steel wire rope under tension holds more than weight, coiled invisibly along its entire length. The way a drawn bowstring holds a shot before the string is ever released, it holds energy too. When that rope is intact, that stored force does exactly what it's supposed to do: lift the load. When a strand gives way under fatigue, corrosion, or a shock load the rope was never rated for, all of that stored energy releases at once, and it does not release gently. The rope doesn't drop. It recoils, backwards, sideways, whichever direction the tension was pulling from, at a velocity that can outrun 18 feet in a single second. Men who've watched a snapped cable up close describe it less like a rope failing and more like a whip made of 40,000 pounds of coiled steel, finding out all at once that nothing is holding it back anymore. Now put a crew inside that blast radius for a living. The crane man rode the left side of the boom, tripping the dipper door by hand, tugging a separate trip line inches from a hoist cable carrying a full load. The engineer sat at the throttle with the main cable running past him on its way to the drum. There was no cage, no shield, no clearance zone marked off on the ground. If the hoist rope let go mid-lift, the whip of parting steel had a straight line to at least one man, sometimes two, and it arrived faster than either of them could turn their head toward the sound. You're standing on that deck right now. It's the middle of a 9-hour shift. The heat is pressing down through your shirt like a hand, and the cable 2 feet from your boot is humming. Not creaking, humming. The sound of steel carrying a load it was rated for, and not 1 pound more. You've heard that hum 1,000 times. You know it means nothing. You also know that somewhere on this cut, on some other shift, on some other machine, that exact sound was the last thing a man heard, before it meant everything. The rope wasn't even the only way this ground fought back. The mountain itself refused to stay where the engineers had drawn it on paper. Loose, waterlogged strata along the west bank of the cut would let go without warning. And when they did, they didn't simply slide. They crept forward like a glacier made of mud, sometimes 14 feet a day for 10 straight days, swallowing whatever machinery happened to be standing in the way. Surviving photographs from February and May of 1913 show 2 numbered Bucyrus shovels, units 201 and 258. Half buried where a slide had caught them mid-cut, loaded flat cars pushed sideways, rail beds torn up like they'd never existed. One landslide alone moved 500,000 cubic yards of earth into the cut in a matter of days. The town built to house the crews wasn't safe from it either. A row of worker housing above the cut, known simply as Steam Shovel Row, sat close enough to the slipping ground that its buildings had to be dismantled and physically relocated twice. Once in 1910, again the following year, as the slide crept closer each time. It never stopped creeping. Eventually, 75 acres of that town slid into the cut for good. Men who ran these machines went home, if the shift allowed it, to houses standing on ground that was quietly failing in the exact same way the rope over their heads was. The engineer overseeing the Culebra Cut, an army officer named David Gaillard, watched slide after slide erase months of work and started calling them tropical glaciers, mud instead of ice, but just as patient, just as unstoppable. In January of 1912, after yet another slide sealed the cut completely, Gaillard asked his superior, Chief Engineer George Washington Goethals, what they were supposed to do about it. Goethals didn't hesitate. Hell, dig it out again. And they did. Every time. That's the part of this machine's story that gets left out of the highlight reel. It kept digging through landslides, through heat, through a rope that could turn on the crew at any second, because stopping was never treated as an option. So the shovel kept running. The rope kept humming, and the men riding that deck kept doing a job where the difference between an ordinary Tuesday and a headline was a few pounds of stress on a piece of twisted steel wire. 5 men, 1 cab, and a job with no second chances. Ask any crane man on this cut what scared him more than the rope, and most of them wouldn't have had an answer, because the honest truth is, nothing scared them more than the rope. It was the one hazard that never took a day off. A crew of 5 ran each of these machines, sometimes 6, if a mechanic was riding along for repairs. The engineer held the throttle and the swing controls, the man whose judgment decided how hard the crowd engine pushed into rock that might or might not have a live dynamite charge buried in it. The crane man worked the boom side, hand-tripping the dipper door on a separate cable, while the main hoist rope did its work a few feet away. 1 or 2 firemen fed the boiler constantly, because a machine burning coal at this rate couldn't afford so much as a 10-minute lapse in steam pressure without stalling mid-lift, which was its own kind of dangerous, a half-raised bucket suddenly losing the force holding it up. And on the ground, a support crew of wheelmen laid fresh rail ahead of the shovel's own tracks, inching the whole 95-ton machine forward toward rock it hadn't dug yet. None of these men were fools. People loved to picture early industrial crews as reckless, men who didn't know any better, throwing themselves at machinery out of ignorance. That's not what the record shows. These were skilled tradesmen who understood exactly what they were operating and exactly what it could do to them, and they went to work anyway, because 6,000 men were competing for jobs on this cut, and the pay was better than almost anything else available. The workforce running these machines came from everywhere. West Indian laborers who made up the overwhelming majority of the excavation crews. Spanish contract workers brought over in large numbers as the project scaled up. American engineers running the operation from the cab and the surveying tent. They didn't share a language half the time. What they shared was a job site where a mistimed signal between the crane man and the engineer could put a 5 cubic yard bucket exactly where a man's body happened to be standing. Every one of those men learned the rhythm of that particular danger the same way, by watching it happen to somebody else first. What did the job actually feel like? Heat first. Panama sits close enough to the equator that shade barely helps, and a boiler running at full pressure 10 feet from your position turned the cab into something closer to a furnace room than an outdoor work site. Noise second. The boiler's scream, the chain drive gears, the hoist drum winding under load, a rhythm so constant that after enough shifts, men stopped hearing it at all, which was its own danger. Because the one sound you needed to catch, a strand starting to fray, a rope beginning to sing wrong under stress, was the one sound most likely to get lost inside all the others. And underneath both of those, Always, the tropical climate itself was quietly working against the explosives stacked nearby. Subterranean heat in the cut was documented to set off dynamite charges before crews were clear, on top of every other danger the job already carried. What made that particular hazard so hard to guard against? A rock face that had already been shot looked identical whether every charge inside it had detonated or whether one was still sitting there live, waiting. A shovel crew had no way to see the difference from the cab. They simply crowded the dipper into the bank the same way they had 1,000 times before, on rock that had always turned out to be safe, until the one time it didn't. For a few minutes at midday, the noise would drop. A crew might climb down off the machine to eat in whatever shade a spoil bank offered. Boots off, watching birds work the cut's upper rim where the rock hadn't been touched yet. Somewhere down the line, a locomotive whistle would answer another locomotive whistle. The only conversation happening between machines instead of men. It was the only quiet the job offered. 20 minutes where the rope wasn't humming and the boiler wasn't screaming, before the whistle called them back to a shift that had no real stopping point until dark. Later historians who tracked down witnesses from the era found one recurring theme: how quickly this level of danger simply became normal. Men working construction weren't shocked by injury or death the way an outside observer might expect. It was priced in, expected, almost administrative. There was even an old line repeated around the isthmus by then, a grim shorthand for what this project cost, that building the railroad through this same stretch of jungle, and by extension the canal that followed it, had run about one human life for every crosty in the track. That was the mindset standing on the cut on the morning of December the 12th, 1908. Nobody working that morning had any reason to believe it would be different from any other morning. It wasn't. Right up until the moment this machine's own rigging helped light a fuse nobody had planned to light at all. The afternoon Basobispo came apart. 22 tons of dynamite were sitting live in the ground, and nothing was supposed to touch them until the crew was ready. At the north end of the Culebra Cut, near a point on the line called Basobispo, crews had spent the morning doing exactly what they did most mornings. More than 50 holes had been drilled into the solid rock of the west bank, every one of them loaded and tamped down tight, fuses set. The one thing that hadn't happened yet was the wiring. The blast wasn't scheduled to go off until the end of the day, so the charges sat live, unconnected, waiting for the crew to finish the last hole before hooking everything up on their own timeline. That was the plan. The plan assumed nothing else on the cut would touch those charges before the crew was ready. A steam shovel was working nearby, close enough, moving along its own rail line, dragging its own tangle of cable and rigging behind it, that a trailing wire from the machine caught the detonator line running to that 22-ton charge. Nobody set out to trigger anything. The machine simply did what it always did: crawl forward, cable dragging, rigging brushing against whatever happened to be in its path. This time, what was in its path was a live blasting circuit. The entire charge went off at once. 50 holes, 22 tons, no warning, no countdown, no whistle. The foreman and his helper were still tamping the final hole when the whole west bank of the cut erupted around them. A passenger train had passed through minutes earlier and somehow wasn't touched. The steam shovel working near the blast, along with its crew, was not so fortunate, buried under a wave of rock and earth that the machine's own rigging had helped set loose. A wire report that ran in papers across the country that week described it in 11 words. The machine and its crew were practically buried under the mass of rocks and earth thrown up. Early estimates guessed 10 dead and 50 wounded. Relief trains ran out from the nearest towns and back again. One of them returned carrying word that 45 of the injured had already been unloaded at the hospital in Ancon. As the day wore on, the count kept climbing. By nightfall, electric lights had been strung across the site, and steam shovels, the same class of machine that had helped trigger the blast, were already back at work under those lights, clearing away the tons of rock and earth, still burying the wounded and the dead. The final tally: 23 men killed, 40 injured. The gang working that stretch of the cut had numbered 129. Most of the dead, the same newspaper noted, were Spaniards, laborers whose individual names never made it into the American press at all. No cause was ever conclusively determined for why the shovel's rigging found that wire when it did. It simply did, and 23 families found out about it from a telegram, or didn't find out at all. Think about what that means for a second. A machine built to move Earth faster than any tool in human history had, in the space of one uncontrolled instant, become the reason the Earth moved on top of the men running it. The exact hardware this entire project depended on to hit its record numbers was the same hardware that turned a live blasting circuit into a mass casualty event. That's the titular debt this whole script has been carrying since the opening minute. This is the afternoon this machine's steel turned an ordinary Tuesday into a mass grave. Through the exact same everyday behavior the machine performed on every other shift without incident. The same crawl, the same drag, the same rigging brushing wherever it happened to brush. The response, such as it was, tells you almost everything you need to know about how this era treated a number like 23. There was no work stoppage. There was no redesign of how shovels moved near live charges. The investigation, if there was one beyond a passing mention in the papers, left no meaningful trace in the historical record. The cut reopened. The shovels went back to work within days, dragging the same kind of trailing rigging past the same kind of live circuits. Because the alternative, slowing down an 8-year, 100 million cubic yard excavation, was never seriously on the table. Men who worked the cut in the years after Basobispo learned to live with what had happened there the same way they'd learned to live with everything else the job threw at them. The work simply continued, because on a project this size, somebody always believed the only real failure would be falling behind schedule. 23 men, one afternoon, one piece of dragging steel rope in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and an industry that absorbed the loss, filed it, and kept building. Where the beast went to die. Every machine that helped build something this big eventually has to answer for what it cost. And this one's bill came due slowly, in ways nobody at the time was tracking closely enough to add up. By the time the SS Ancon made the first official transit of the completed canal, on August the 15th of 1914, the total human cost of the project had climbed past 5,600 lives. Disease took the overwhelming majority of that number, especially in the earliest years before sanitation efforts caught up with the mosquito-borne fevers, killing men by the hundreds. But the shovels, the dynamite, and the landslides carved out their own share of that toll. A share the record never separated out cleanly, because nobody in charge saw much reason to keep that particular column of the ledger. One laborer who lived through those years summed up what that kind of era did to a man's sense of scale. Looking back decades later at what he'd witnessed on the cut, he put it about as plainly as anyone ever did. It was a very awful sight to see how they dig out the bodies. Awful, and also, by his own account, unremarkable. Just another Tuesday on a project that had long since stopped treating a body count as news. Once the canal was finished, the machines that built it didn't get museum pedestals. They got sold off. Bucyrus and Marion shovels from the Panama fleet were shipped out to Alaska, to Spain, to Costa Rica, to construction sites back in Ohio, wherever the next contract needed a machine that could still move Earth for another decade or two. Not one of them stayed in Panama. The canal that made this machine famous doesn't have a single confirmed example of it left standing on its own banks. The only verified survivor of that original fleet, confirmed through its own builder's plate, stamped 1799, shipped out of Marion, Ohio, back in 1904, is a Marion model shovel that finished its working life on the Costa Rican Railroad and now sits, unrestored but intact, outside a university museum in the town of Turrialba. It isn't roped off. It isn't lit for visitors. It's just there, quietly holding its shape, 70-some years after it last moved a bucket of anything. The rope that once hung off its boom, whatever became of it, is long gone. What's left is the frame that used to carry the load, standing in the shade with nothing left to lift. Go looking elsewhere and you'll find other survivors scattered the same way. A Marion shovel converted to crawler tracks in the 1920s, worked until 1949, then parked beside a road in upstate New York and left there, as of the last confirmed record, exactly where it stopped. No fence, no plaque explaining what the rope on that machine was capable of on a bad day. Just 100 tons of quiet steel, sitting in a field, looking a great deal more peaceful than it ever behaved on the clock. It would be worth asking, at this point, whether anything ever came along to formally fix what killed those 23 men at Basobispo, and however many more the record never separated out cleanly. The honest answer is, not for a long time, and not because of anything that happened in Panama. Numbered, codified rejection standards for a worn wire rope, a fixed count of broken strands that legally takes a cable out of service, the kind every crane operator works under today, wouldn't exist in any organized form for decades. The industry that built two oceans together in a decade took the better part of a century to write down, in plain numbers, exactly how dangerous a rope was allowed to get before somebody had to replace it. Meanwhile, the class of machine this shovel belonged to didn't die with the canal. It kept growing, for decades, into something almost absurd. Mining companies scaled the same cable and rope design up into monsters that would have made the 95-ton Panama shovels look like toys. Stripping machines built for coal operations across the eastern United States through the 1950s and 60s, with bucket capacities that eventually reached into the hundreds of cubic yards. One of them, built in the following decades, carried a bucket rated at 180 cubic yards, big enough to swallow a 3-bedroom house in a single bite, and still ran on the exact same principle as the machine at Basobispo: steel wire rope, wound on a drum, holding everything up. The pride never really went away. If anything, it got bigger, right up until the moment the technology that finally ended it arrived from an entirely different direction. That technology was hydraulics. Only after the Second World War, once engineers had developed hose systems that could reliably handle serious pressure, did hydraulic excavators start taking real market share away from cable-rigged machines. And the advantage ran deeper than raw power, straight to the exact danger this whole script has been building toward. A hydraulic ram doesn't store 17 feet of recoil the way a parted wire rope does. It doesn't hum with stored energy for 10 hours a day. When something fails on a hydraulic machine, it tends to fail quietly. A leak, a stall, instead of catastrophically. One man could now do work that used to take a crew of 4 or 5 standing inside a rope's strike radius. By the 1930s, steam and cable shovels were already losing ground on general construction sites. By the post-war decades, the writing was on the wall almost everywhere except the largest surface mines, where sheer scale kept a shrinking number of giant rope shovels working into the modern era. That's the fall the title promised. Nobody upgraded to hydraulics out of a sudden attack of conscience. The industry didn't wake up one morning and decide a rope this dangerous was unacceptable. It simply found a machine that could hit the same numbers without the liability, and the liability had been men the entire time. Nobody wrote a eulogy for the cable shovel when the orders slowed. There was no ceremony, no formal retirement, no accounting of what the class of machine had actually cost across its working life. The orders simply stopped, and the ones already in the field kept running until they wore out or got sold for scrap. The same way the company had always treated everything else that broke down on the job. 23 men at Basobispo. An unknown, uncounted number more across a decade of routine hoist cable failures the newspapers never bothered to individually report, because a rope parting on a construction site had stopped being news the same year it stopped being rare. That whole toll got folded into a project the company brochures still describe as one of the great triumphs of American engineering. That triumph was real. So was the bill. This machine dug the ditch that reshaped global shipping for the next 110 years, and it did it by treating a length of dangerously loaded steel cable as an acceptable, ordinary, everyday cost of getting the job done faster than the competition. The land itself never got a vote either. A river was dammed to drown a valley and make Gatun Lake. A mountain that had stood in that spot since long before anyone thought to build a country was lowered by more than 60 feet and gouged 9 miles wide. The jungle that had made this whole project a graveyard for the French got cleared and burned back, mile by mile, by a machine that simply outworked it. Nobody wrote a legacy assessment for the ground. It just isn't there anymore, the same way 23 names aren't there anymore. Picture the two images side by side, because that's really what this whole story has been. On one side, a 95-ton machine in full violence, cables screaming under load, a president grinning at the controls, 70,000 cubic yards moved in 26 days, the numbers everyone wanted printed. On the other side, the same class of machine, decades later, sitting silent outside a small museum in Costa Rica, no rope left on it at all, nothing left to lift, and nobody left to threaten. Both images are true. The industry only ever wanted you looking at one of them. The mountain got its canal, the company got its record book, and 23 men, most of them never named in the papers that reported on their deaths, got buried under the very rock this machine was built to move, killed by a piece of the same steel rigging that made the whole project possible in the first place. They don't build them like that anymore, not the shovels, and not, thank God, the tolerance for what a machine like that was allowed to cost.